how it impacts on the cost of living and people outgoings. Fianna Fáil were talking health. They were promising 2,000 more beds, amongst other things, in the health service. Sinn Féin promising 100,000 extra houses. Solidarity People Before Profit also talking about housing. Labour talking about legislation to address the gender pay gap, and the Social Democrats talking about biodiversity. The Green Party out on the canvas and other parties out on the trail as well. But first, to kick it off today, to paraphrase Bertie Ahern, Micheál, I'm joined, by the way, by Micheál Lehane, our political correspondent, and Mary Regan, a political reporter. Bertie Ahern once accused Gay Mitchell of being a waffler. Michael Healy-Rae, a raffler. What's the controversy there?
The controversy seems to have arisen from what Michael Healy-Rae says is his traditional now election fundraiser, where he sends out letters to a few targeted supporters. He said only about 150. Rumours were that thousands of tickets have been sold for this raffle. He said that's completely untrue. But anyway, all such raffles, it seems, need a permit. He thought the Gardaí in Killarney has signed off on this permit, but he has confirmed that he has received information now from the guards that he needs to complete more paperwork, and that's on the way to him to finalise the permit. But it shows political fundraising. It's not as easy as it used to be, and it's under closer scrutiny than ever before. First prize for that raffle was €1,000, of course. Tickets €30, but there's only for targeted supporters now, so you probably just can't easily get one if you didn't get the letter.
Right.
50 for 2 tickets.
Okay, maybe a premium phone line indeed might work just as well, but obviously you need a licence for that too.
Pension Kerry, is it?
The pensions have become a public source of much public grievance. People who retire, just to get into the issue, people who retire at 65 aren't entitled to their state pension until 67. They've got 2 years potentially on job seekers allowance, going into their local job seekers office and justifying what they're doing in the job hunt. Mary, we were kicking around a couple of topics to come up with last week, and you said in a very unscientific straw poll in your near neighbourhood that actually pensions were mentioned by everyone you were talking to, was it?
Yeah, and not just people who are retiring age, but people, who are approaching retirement age. This is one of these issues, and in a very typical Irish political style, it's been going on for years. There's been consultation papers, there's been task forces, there's been a number of governments and parties involved in this sort of pension reform, and now in the opening week of a general election campaign, it's blown up as this big issue. TDs themselves, candidates, are also reporting. They were saying as early as Thursday and Friday that this is coming up on the doorsteps. This is being raised. There's a lot of anger about this. And, I mean, it speaks to this sense that people are just being treated unfairly. The live line on Joe Duffy was alive today with people ringing saying, that they'll be retiring, but they won't be entitled to their pension, and they'll have to apply essentially for the job seekers allowance, and all that entails, having to look for other jobs at the age of 65, jobs they may not feel that they have the qualifications for. So the parties have been responding to this, and Sinn Féin is saying that, it will, Sinn Féin, in fairness to them, were the first to speak about this, saying that they will make the pension age 65 again. Fianna Fáil saying that they would outlaw contracts that force people to retire at 65 when their state pension mightn't kick in until sometime later. Labour are saying as part of any of their negotiations as part of government formation, they'll insist that the pension age doesn't increase to 67.
A red line, they said that was.
Yeah, an absolute red line. So it's interesting. It could become an issue in government formation talks. And Fine Gael saying they'd come up with some sort of transition payment to bridge that gap between when you lose out on your pension and you've lost you've retired from your job, and until you qualify for the state pension.
Yeah, Regina Doherty not giving any great detail on that, though, saying that it would be a transition payment. It wouldn't come out of the social insurance fund and would really be there so that people could travel and wouldn't have to sign on every week, but no further detail on what the exact payment would be and how much of a bridge there still would be between the state pension and, we'll say, this transition payment.
The difference at the moment being of the 40 or so euro between the state pension and the job seekers allowance. People estimating losing between 2,000 and 3,000 euro per annum on this. But one of the things, and Mary mentioned Liveline there, that one of the lightning rods on this is that people are contrasting the system that applies to politicians getting their pension and them getting their pension. So pity the politician who lands up on a doorstep to take the soundings on this.
Yeah, and even though there have been changes along the way, there was a time when a politician retired and if they were a minister, they were entitled to a very substantial pension straight away, that has changed and the age limit has now increased, but they still get it much younger than the proposed 68, which is the way things are seemingly destined to go here. And that, of course, kicks in the year 2028, so it's not too far away.
Yeah, because what you know under this proposal that's currently in place, politicians, those whose service dates back to before 2013, they'll still get their pensions at the age of 65, while everyone else will have to wait till 68. So, answer that one on the doorsteps, politicians.
And there were mutterings also that this actually dates back to the Troika. Ireland had to do that. It's a long-term structural shift to put its finances on a sustainable footing, and that in order to provide pensions into the future as people live longer, that this was a necessary move. But that's not good. Talk of the Troika, to paraphrase an ex-minister, is not going to butter any parsnips in this election campaign.
It's not, and especially when you contrast it with some of the kind of promises that are being made today. And there's a boom feel to this, isn't there? It's getting boomier and boomier. At the same time, you have this legacy issue and it's still there, and it's a profound one for so many thousands of people.
Baby boxes are pretty boomy too.
Well, it depends on what way you look at the baby boxes. This might win the prize as being one of the most woke policy proposals of this campaign. Finnish baby boxes, which are very commonplace, have been historically in Finland, given to parents when they leave hospital. The purpose is almost ideological in a sense, in that every baby starts life in the exact same way, the same clothes, the same amount of nappies, food, whatever their requirements are. And there's a proposal today to provide those. It comes up regularly in Irish political discourse, providing a baby box to everyone leaving hospital after the birth of their newborn. Of course, you can buy them for about 350 quid online. Yeah. They're very hipster thing to have these days.
It takes us back to where we were. Remember, there was a payment long before the country hit the buffers in the economic crash. When a baby was born, there was a payment you would receive. But of course, that again was something that the Troika quickly took away. But I suppose
the provenance of this proposal, it's a government proposal, is it? Or it's coming from the...
It's a Fine Gael. It's a
Fine Gael proposal. But the other, in mentioning that this is a Finnish proposal, the other thing people are going to contrast between Ireland and Finland is obviously the biggest boon that people in Finland get is affordable childcare.
Yeah. And I mean, this is something the government's talking about, and it clearly is one of the big issues that they're getting in the campaign trail. And they mention the National Childcare Scheme, but again, it seems fairly paltry in the context of that woman who tackled the Taoiseach in Cavan the last day, where she was saying almost the majority of her income is going on childcare. And it really is, you'd have to say, something of an indictment of successive governments that the childcare costs relative to incomes are still huge. As well as that, if you look at things, you can talk about baby boxes, but then you can look at the assessment of need waiting lists, which in some cases have been up to 2 years for children who need assessments for therapies, things like speech therapy and on other forms of intervention. That's all there. You can talk about the huge waiting list for child social workers, and then the return in money from the Department of Children running to tens of millions, something that was mentioned by PAC in some detail not too long ago. And you put all that together, and then you have a baby box proposal, and you'd have to say, well, that raises certain questions. Is this really just mere election marketing and nothing more than that?
And also, this issue of childcare is also an issue that candidates are hearing an awful lot about. And in the week before the general election, we're going to see a protest outside the Dáil of childcare workers. And also, because of this issue around insurance for creches before Christmas, you're seeing a lot of creches around the country putting their fees up in the new year.
And inspections of creches, compliance issues for creches is another issue. People feeling that they're being inspected to within an inch of their life and failing or being called to account on some minor issues. And obviously, everything on this has come into sharp focus since the RT investigates standards in creches investigation as well.
Yeah, and that's when the Taoiseach was out in Cavan, his first day on the campaign trail last week. That was one issue that was being raised with him, there was a creche worker saying there was a piece of furniture that had to be removed from the room because it was too big, or there was a kind of mud playing station thing that was deemed too dirty, even though that was the whole purpose of it for play reasons. So, the childcare issue is definitely one that's featuring prominently in this campaign.
Like it was in 2007, and like things back then, like the M50 toll. Do you remember that was a big one? You're into those quality of life issues. And ultimately, I suppose that means that this is probably going to come down to some great economic debate in the last weeks again as to who can safeguard that and who can provide those kind of changes that will ultimately try and lower the cost of living for people. And that probably is the way the campaign is leaning towards, despite the fact that housing was such a huge issue in the early days of it.
There is no blame sharing here, though, in this election, because the government will argue competence. It will say what it wants to do and it'll say what it's already started doing. The question opposition parties will ask is, well, why haven't you done what you're promising already, or why haven't you done more of it already? With the Independent Alliance fading away, the only team or party answering for what the government has done, or indeed what it hasn't done, is obviously Fine Gael.
Yeah, and they didn't have, Fine Gael don't have the sort of buffer that they might have had with the Labour Party taking a lot of the flack in the last general election campaign. And yeah, I mean, as you said, left defending the government's record, but sometimes appearing to be too bogged down in the technical or the arguments, which, might be correct in terms of statistics, but maybe not appearing to be in tune with the mood out there.
You can see there's a difference in approach there. Looking back at the week in politics there on Sunday, Charlie Flanagan was being asked about this proposal for the evidence of a chief superintendent to be taken as, with regard to membership of a gang, that should be sufficient. He said two things. He said the Department of Justice didn't support it, and there was also caution about it to some degree at senior levels of An Garda Síochána. Fianna Fáil, Mark Daly was straight in to say that they would be guided by the people, that the government was out of touch, and he mentioned also as a dad. That he was speaking as a dad. There's an element there of Fine Gael is emphasising its technocratic ability and its competence, whereas other parties are showing their empathy. And when election campaigns get into sentiment and get into emotion, the technocratic arguments may be found wanting.
Yeah, they may be, and Fine Gael is banky on that. And I mean, do they have only one strategy though? And everything comes down to those final days, and they believe that that's what's going to win through, that it won't be the constant emphasis from Fianna Fáil and others on a decent society, looking at the waiting list and the like, that it comes down to economic management. And you did see that in 2007. You saw the turn after Pat Rabbitt's comments about money could be found somewhere in a drawer in the Department of Finance. And that's the moment at which Brian Cowan intervenes, and you do come down to very technical economic arguments at that point, delivered with a degree of passion that turned that election for the sitting government going for a third term. Is something akin to that going to happen now? Well, you can't see, firstly, the fact that Fianna Fáil are being so cagey in how they're presenting their policy. You feel there won't be a Pat Rabbitt type gap left open, and equally it's hard to see who the Brian Cowan figure would be on this Fine Gael side, who would have the passion to go in and turn that. Perhaps that will happen, but as of now, it's hard to see a repeat of that.
Mary, we had a poll over the weekend, and as with all polls, they are only opinions, they are only indicators. This was a behaviour and attitudes poll that was done in face-to-face interviews with 993 people. But nonetheless, depending on how you look at it, from the government or from the Fine Gael point of view, it is it's a bad showing in the poll, given that it shows them 12 points behind Fianna Fáil, but it also plays into something you touched on the last time we spoke, which was they're playing themselves as coming as the underdog to this competition, and it's early days.
Yeah, I mean, polls can do a certain number of things that sort of change the trajectory, I guess, of an election campaign. One of them is just, how they might change parties themselves and how they approach the election, how they might change their messaging halfway or a third of the way or a certain few days in. Another is that they often instigate talk about what we call coalitionology and the role of smaller parties might play to make up the numbers. But what's the third thing is the public perception is often moved by polls for right or wrong reasons. And I think what this poll is interesting for is what it says about Fianna Fáil having that much of a gap over Fine Gael, the poll would suggest at this early stage. Now, there's two ways of looking at that. One of it is it places the target on Fianna Fáil. It's a sort of role reversal, if you like, that Micheál Martin suddenly becomes the person who has to justify his suitability as Taoiseach. And Fine Gael actually got the ball rolling on this before the poll was even published, with Paschal Donohoe saying last week that they were neck and neck, and he was saying Fianna Fáil are going around the country thinking they're going to win an election. So Fine Gael clearly trying to put the focus on Fianna Fáil and the onus on Fianna Fáil to prove their suitability. But an alternative way of looking at it is that people like to back a winner maybe, and this whole issue, that this whole claim that Fianna Fáil was a toxic brand after 2011 is what Professor Tim Bale told them they were, and that they were essentially a thrash brand. The more their numbers show a level of increase in the polls, the more that branding becomes less of an issue for them. So it could go either of those two ways. Following this poll,
that Sunday Times poll, Micheál, it should be said, was taken before the general election, but during the great Black and Tan controversy.
Yeah, it was. It would have been there for the bulk of that, and could that have been influential in it? At the same time, there was a lot of election speculation at that point, so that has to be considered as well. It's a decent sized sample. The margin of error, 3.3%. It did catch both parties by surprise. Apparently, they did expect a gap, it seems, on both sides, with Fianna Fáil ahead, but nothing of this order in Munster. And of course, when you go in then to the specific areas, the margin of error will get more pronounced. But it does seem like there is a big gap between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in Munster. That is important because the way of Fine Gael trying to regain seats in this election was always trying to win back some of the 10 or so that were lost in Munster. That looks to be an even greater challenge. Paschal Donohoe saying today it will galvanise the troops. Again, though, I think it comes back to that one strategy. Is there more to the Fine Gael strategy? Is there something on the sideline, and someone can do something to change it and mix it at this point? If there isn't, you think that makes their challenge more difficult unless things change during the course of the campaign?
Well, when can we expect the next polls, first of all, and how much will that turn the debate not so much about competence and technocratic ability, but into what you said there, Mary, into coalitionology? When will the questions from the press pool start to be asked? If the results would stay in and around that, or if both parties are held back, when do people just start asking about, well, what are your coalition options? And that becomes the primary line of questioning then.
Yeah, I suppose there's a confirmed Sunday Business poll next weekend, and that's the one people will be watching because they have been the consistent tracker poll, and whatever emerges there will be interesting. I suppose that question around coalition, that's kind of there already, isn't there? And there's kind of this sense has emerged that as of now, Labour, the Greens and Fianna Fáil would be seen to be offering something of an alternative. That has never been nailed down, but that is certainly the kind of the indication that's building. But again, I mean, if you're back to a 3 or 4 point gap next Saturday evening in the Business Post poll, well, then that changes it. And then it comes back to being neck and neck, and it comes back to a very interesting final 2 weeks of the campaign.
And Mary, Sinn Féin trying to put themselves forward very much, and despite the protestations of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil saying that they are a party of government, they are offering themselves as alternative ministers. Most recently today, Eoin Ó Broin saying he would be an alternative housing minister to what's there at the moment.
Yeah, so Eoin Murphy was launching his housing policy today, and he was saying... Eoin Ó Broin, sorry, launching the housing policy and saying, look, you have a choice between Eoin Murphy, and look at the catalogue of failures there, or you have a choice between Darragh O'Brien on the other hand, who's more or less what he said is supported and facilitated Eoin Murphy. So he was saying that he is a housing minister with vision, with the capability behind him, and he really wants to fix this. So I guess what Sinn Féin are trying to do is to pitch themselves as, a potential and a viable choice for government, and the only real choice is how they would see it, because they find themselves in this situation now where they're squeezed a little bit with the two traditional parties of government, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, one side of them both vying to be the biggest parties, and then the smaller parties who are presenting themselves as would-be kingmakers in a coalition. So you look at Sinn Féin and say, where do they fall into this? And they would argue that this latest poll suggests they're 19%, just 1 percentage point behind Fine Gael. So they're saying if Fine Gael are being seen as viable choice to lead a government, then why can't we be seen in such a way?
I think even then, if you look at the core vote on it, I think they're actually ahead of Fine Gael if you take out the undecideds. But I mean, that's That is what it is, you know.
etc., etc. Yeah, Micheál, we have a row today. Things had settled down, but we have a row to kick off the week.
We do, yeah. This is something that's exercised Fianna Fáil. I know this for a while. It's the Fine Gael ministers, and they still hold those ministerial cloaks, and indeed the Taoiseach, when they're doing state business, making political pops and using it for political purposes. And this morning at an event to mark Apple's time here and the jobs it's created, the Taoiseach spoke about his political opponents, how they would tear up the national broadband plan. He said it doesn't matter. They wouldn't do it, and it doesn't matter. They're not going to get into government anyway. Not a statesman type thing to do, says Fianna Fáil. They've written to the Standards and Public Office Commission saying this is an abuse of the office of Taoiseach. They're annoyed too about ads talking about minimum wage increases being placed on the front page of newspapers during an election cycle. I suppose it all points to the fact if you had an electoral commission here, the rules would be very clear. It shows too the difficulty always for the people who don't hold the keys to government during an election cycle. But it raises interesting questions.
Mary?
This kind of goes back to the whole, remember the Strategic Communications Unit and Fianna Fáil's issue with that state money was being used really for what they saw as a marketing exercise to market the government, and particularly Fine Gael as they saw it.
It's one to watch anyway. This whether or not SIPO come back to them with a yay or an A, it could play into the last couple of weeks of campaigning.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, for definite.
It just depends. Will Leo Varadkar put on his Taoiseach gown more and more in the next few weeks? Will ministers do it as well on announcements and things like that? I mean, it's not new.
But they're not going to Davos. That won't happen. We did have the site before of the Minister for Finance and the Taoiseach going to Davos and presenting Ireland being open for investment. That wasn't the chosen venue to be seen.
So where did the Taoiseach go? The club finals. The club finals is where it's at, not Davos and all the glamour. That's where he had to go. And you'd have to say Leo Varadkar, insofar as you can ever judge anyone at a game where they don't have skin in the game, you know, watching Club All Ireland's as a neutral, he did look a little forlorn at times there. And it went to extra time as well. And you know, that's what election cycles mean. That's where you have to be on that day in January and not over with some of the most powerful people in the world.
Okay, well, there'll be jostling in the tunnel between now and the 8th of February, much like that final.
You think back to the O2 campaign, it was a time when you had a lot of jobs announcements, and think of the government in that day, and there was a load of jobs announcements made in the weeks leading up to that particular election, and it was done so, ministers doing it in their constituencies. So while Fianna Fáil are vexed on this one, it does happen when people are in power.
Okay, all right. Well, remember, if you haven't registered to vote Wednesday, that's the day after tomorrow is the deadline. You can go to checktheregister.ie for details. If you liked what you heard in this podcast, subscribe on the usual platforms. You can get us on the RTE News website. Feel free to leave a review with your thoughts on it as well. But from Mary Regan, political reporter, political correspondent Micheál Lehane, and me, Colm O'Mungan, that's all from us for today. We're back tomorrow.